Excellent. All right, everyone. So this session today is getting started with ORCID, what you and your researchers need to know. So to begin, we'll start with some staff introductions. So your ORCID US Community staff are pictured here. Sheila Rabin, the Senior Strategist of Research Infrastructure Programs, Paolo Gihilde, the Strategist for the ORCID US Community, and myself, Kayla Ramhit, the Program Assistant for the ORCID US Community. And I'll also go over our agenda today. We'll start by talking about ORCID. What is ORCID? We'll talk about the benefits of ORCID for organizations and then ways in which ORCID is being used by organizations. Then we'll really get into the main objective of this session. What ways can you leverage ORCID benefits and support your researchers using ORCID at your organization? And this is really about education and outreach, getting ORCID memberships. You can use tools and services to take advantage of ORCID's benefits for your researchers. And once you have a membership and have been doing outreach, how you can continue to maintain momentum in educating your researchers and using ORCID. So we'll also share some resources that can really help in those areas as well. And lastly, we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers, Q&A. So let's get started with ORCID. One thing we want to remind you all to please ask questions during the Q&A or in the chat as the session progresses. We did ask when you registered if you had any questions to share those with us, as we really want to address those questions. Things like, what does my ORCID membership allow me to do? How can I educate and inform researchers about ORCID? What are the next steps now that we've done outreach, have an integration, etc.? So today's session is all about ORCID, how to get started with using ORCID, how you can educate yourself, your fellow staff, your researchers, and stakeholders about ORCID, how best to utilize it in workflows and systems, and to maximize the use you can get out of ORCID and other persistent identifiers. And continuing on that path and asking yourself, what's next? How can we keep using ORCID to its fullest? So please do ask questions in the chat and during the Q&A. All right, so let's start with what is ORCID? So ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. ORCID is an identifier that is meant to uniquely identify researchers so that they can get credit and attribution for their work, streamline a researcher's digital identity so that an organization can save time on administrative tasks, and keep track of a researcher's affiliations and contributions all in one place. ORCID is a nonprofit, community-driven organization that serves the global research community. There are three main components to ORCID. The ORCID ID, which is the unique persistent identifier that is free of charge to researchers and individuals. The ORCID record, which includes information about the individual from their employment history, education, and works, as well as many other things. And the ORCID API, or Application Programming Interface. The ORCID API allows the research community to work collaboratively with ORCID by allowing connections between the ORCID record and member organizations. So we'll go into more detail about the ORCID API a little bit later. But for now, let's talk about the ORCID ID. So an ORCID ID is a 16-digit number that is unique to the individual. It distinguishes researchers from each other and is free for anyone to use. So you'll see here Paolo's ORCID ID. You'll notice it looks like a link, and that's because it is. So the ORCID ID links to his ORCID record. So if we click on that link, we're taken to Paolo's ORCID record, which is populated with information similar to what you might see on a CV or a resume. The ORCID US Community has an ORCID workshop for researchers that we put on quarterly each year that goes into more detail, but I'll briefly mention what can be found within an ORCID record now. So using our volunteer researcher Sophia's ORCID record as an example, you'll see here that her ORCID record contains a section for different name formations, a biography, her country, and a section for keywords describing her research areas, and importantly, a section on her employment history. So if we scroll down, we start to see the other sections, her education and qualifications, her professional activities, such as membership, service, distinction, invited positions. Further down, we start to see what funding she's received, research equipment she's used, her works, which includes publications she's written, and lastly, her peer review activity. So we also want to share something fairly new this year. ORCID has introduced some new work types to better support a wider range of arts and humanities research outputs. So here are just a few: musical compositions, artistic outputs, images, lectures, blogs, interviews, patents, conference presentations, and many other work types. They've improved the user experience when manually entering work type information. And for more information about the changes and the new work types, ORCID has a blog post that goes into more detail, and we'll post a link to that in the chat for you. So now let's move on to the benefits of ORCID. So ORCID can distinguish researchers from each other. An ORCID ID can persist over time, even if a researcher's name or anything in this life changes. It can bolster researchers' digital identity, ensure that researchers meet funder, publisher, and reporting requirements, and it can also help save time when filling out forms and reducing administrative burden. So let's start with how it distinguishes researchers from each other. In this example of a PubMed abstract, you'll notice that there are a lot of authors with similar names. It's hard to tell who is who without any additional information to distinguish them from one another. So an ORCID ID ensures that our researchers' research outputs and activities are correctly attributed to them. An ORCID ID stays the same and can tie a researcher to their affiliations and activities throughout their career, even if their name changes or they share a name with someone else. An ORCID record can also concern a researcher's affiliations. So if your organization is writing to ORCID and the researcher authorizes that organization to write their record, they become a trusted organization in that researcher's ORCID record. So the organization will show up as the source of the record they write. So for example, the University of Virginia has written employment to their researcher's record, and they show up as its source. This demonstrates how an organization can lend credibility to a researcher's record, confirming that a researcher is employed at their organization to make that information more accurate and trustworthy. So you also notice in the source field this green check mark, which is visible in the record, and this is called the trust marker. Trust markers further verify visibly that the organization is a trusted source, reinforcing that the information in the record is authoritative and credible. So an ORCID ID can also streamline the collection of data for certain workflows. This is useful for organizations to help with evaluation, with reporting and assessment. All organizations in the research ecosystem can benefit from ORCID in this way. If an organization collects the researcher's ORCID ID, they can then use that ID to assess impact, help with research reporting, evaluate a researcher's work, and help with determining promotion and advancement. To make the process even easier, organizations can use several different systems, such as digital measures, symplectic elements, Pure, to track a researcher's work and achievements through the use of the ORCID API, making this transfer of data automatic and saving staff time. Speaking of staff time, but an ORCID record can also help save time and reduce administrative burden in workflows and research reporting for researchers. So a researcher can sign in with their ORCID credentials, import information from their ORCID record to populate applications or progress reports, and organizations can automatically add awards, works, or funding to a researcher's ORCID record so a researcher doesn't have to, making this process more automated to save both the researcher and the organization's time. An ORCID record can also help organizations stay connected with their researchers. So when a researcher connects the ORCID ID with an organization, authorizing them access, the organization can follow them through their career to see the work they've done, what funding they've received, evaluate their research outputs, assess for impact, and better support their research and career as they develop. And finally, an ORCID record can help leverage interoperability. So an ORCID ID can make connections to support and enrich the cyclical nature of the research ecosystem. The relationships between publishers, funders, employers, and researchers can all benefit from the use and connections made by using ORCID. This is also true of the different systems that each member of the research ecosystem uses. So with ORCID, making these connections and using these different systems in conjunction with ORCID can help make processes between funders, publishers, employers, and researchers easier and more trustworthy. And with that, I will pass it on to Paolo to talk about how ORCID is being used by organizations.
Thank you, Kayla. So now let's dive into how ORCID is being used by organizations and how they are utilizing the third component of ORCID, which Kayla talked about earlier, and that is the API or the Application Programming Interface. On the next slide, to quickly recap, the API is the key to connect the organization's local systems, such as faculty success or digital measures. It could be Pure or Proposal Central with ORCID. The API enables the exchange of data between systems, and the API is the piece of infrastructure that leverages interoperability. So one of ORCID benefits that Kayla talked about earlier. Through the API, Systems are, through the API, systems are able to interoperate, exchange data as it uses the functionalities of ORCID. With ORCID, the API allows organizations such as universities and colleges, funders and publishers, and others to read or pull data to their researchers from the ORCID record, and researchers to have the data pushed or written to their ORCID records from organizations. So in the next few slides, we will have examples of these four ORCID API functions. Now here on this slide, what you're seeing are the three types of ORCID integration. So primarily, member organizations uses the member APIs to integrate their local systems with ORCID. So the three ways that organizations can do this or can integrate with ORCID is one, through using a vendor's systems. Now we've talked a little bit about how, for example, faculty success or digital measures or symplectic elements or Esploro. So these are vendor systems that can integrate with ORCID using a member API. The second way that you can integrate with ORCID is through ORCID's Affiliation Manager. Affiliation Manager is a tool available within ORCID or available to ORCID members via a consortium like the ORCID US Community, for example. So Affiliation Manager allows for writing or pushing affiliations data to ORCID. So these affiliations are employment, education, qualifications, invited positions, membership, service, and distinctions to researchers' ORCID records. And finally, the third way that you can integrate with ORCID, or organizations can integrate with ORCID, is through a custom integration. Custom integration is more flexible and adaptable to the needs of your organizations. So think of basically customizing something, right? So this is a way for you to customize the way that you are integrating with ORCID. So depending on your needs as an organization or depending on what you would like your system to be capable of, this is a way to customize using a member API key. Now on the next slide, these three types of integration uses the ORCID member API. So we've talked a little bit about now of what the API can do. The API has essentially four main functionalities that can be used either as a standalone function and or a combination of different functionalities in these four things that you are seeing on the screen. Now, depending on your own context as an organization, we are definitely happy to talk to you about this kind of functionalities and how your own context can benefit from this functionality. So don't hesitate to email us at orcidus@lyrasis.org if you want to talk about in details on how you can do this in your own organization. Now, that said, we will briefly discuss these four functionalities in the next few slides. On the next slide, the first one is signing in to systems using your own ORCID login credentials. So the ORCID API allows for the use of logging in to systems using your ORCID username and password. So this makes it easier so you don't have to think about other passwords or create other usernames or passwords when logging into different systems. So systems like ScienceCV, for example, OpenEuro, which is a data imaging database, and Proposal Central, or a funding system, um, are capable of logging in using an ORCID credential. So again, you don't have to remember another username or password. You just use your ORCID login credentials to be able to log into these systems. And that's one of the functionalities of a member API. It makes it easier for you and your researchers so you don't have to remember or create another set of credentials. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the second function. So the second function is really about for organizations to get authenticated ORCID IDs. So logging into a system using your ORCID credentials and providing organizations the permissions to get either, say, an ORCID, to get data from your ORCID record, or either to read data from your ORCID record or write data to your ORCID record. Those are just examples of permissions that researchers provide to organizations. So this functionality really is about following the OAuth or simply the authentication process within ORCID. Through this process, organizations are able to receive or get authenticated ORCID IDs in their system. So for this example here, you're seeing in the screen is from University of Arizona. So here, researchers are asked to connect their ORCID IDs with the university. So they would go through the authentication process, and the authentication makes sure that they have the correct ORCID ID for the specific researcher. Now, some organizations may want your ORCID ID number by typing in or manually entering your ORCID ID. So that works as well. However, that's not an authenticated ORCID IDs. Typing in and manually entering ORCID IDs really opens it up to the possibility of typos or incorrect ORCID IDs for your researcher. So you could have somebody leaving out a number, for example, or somebody's copying and pasting the incorrect ORCID ID. So now you have a mismatch of researchers from their ORCID IDs. So this is why authentication is very important when getting authenticated ORCID IDs within ORCID. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the third function of the member API. And this is reading or pulling data from researchers' ORCID records. The ORCID API allows for reading data from ORCID. So data such as works or publications, for example, funding that the researchers have received, or peer review activities. So it could also be education or professional activities. These data from ORCID can then be added to a system. So, for example, a faculty reporting system or a faculty profile pages. And that's what you're seeing here on this page and this slide. For example, this is an example from Brandeis University showing publications and works in their Scholar Works profile page. And this is actually an Explorer system as well. So data from ORCID can basically get pulled can be pulled by organizations using the API, and then their organizations can use it to either populate their faculty profile pages, or it could be for a faculty reporting system, for example, or any other things that they would like to do, such as perhaps an analysis of the research within the organization. And finally, on the next slide, we're going to talk about the fourth function of the member API. And this is about writing or pushing data to ORCID. The ORCID member API allows for organizations to write data to their researchers. We can see examples here where Binghamton University pushed employment information to their researcher, so letting everyone know that this researcher, this individual works for Binghamton University. We also see an example of a funding entry to somebody's ORCID record, and this one is from American Heart Association, basically showing us the award that this researcher has received from American Heart Association. And finally, there's an example, a publication example with Vibly here. Now, on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about talk basically the details about education and outreach. So the ORCID API is quite technical, and honestly, you probably don't want to talk to your faculty about the technical aspects of the API. You'll probably get them lost or something like that. So we want to talk to our researchers and students and other stakeholders basically the talking points about ORCID. So the next slide, for example, we're going to talk about what are the things that our researchers need to know, right? So earlier, Kayla talked about the benefits of ORCID. So the benefits to you and your researchers should be the focus of your conversations. So this should be the focus of our conversations with our researchers. Why is it important for them to have an ORCID ID? What are the benefits of connecting their ORCID ID with your organization? Or perhaps connecting their ORCID ID with systems such as Science CV or Symplectic Elements or faculty success or digital measures. Benefits such as uniquely identifying researchers, think of ORCID IDs like, for example, like a social security number for researchers. So it is unique to that individual. Having an ORCID ID and populated ORCID records allows for saving time and administrative processes. So whether you're applying for a grant or submitting a manuscript, for example, for publications, so those kind of saves you time in making sure that you're putting the data or the data that the funders or the publishers are looking for. So these are just some benefits that you want to talk to your researchers. So think of the benefits really that we've already talked about earlier, that Kayla talked about as your talking points. Now, in addition to those, in the next few slides, we're gonna go into a little bit more details about other talking points that you can have a conversation with your stakeholders, with your researchers. So the first one is meeting funder requirements. Federal funding agencies such as NIH, NSF, DOE, and others basically were instructed to have policies related to persistent identifiers for individuals. So that's sort of like the terminology that the federal government is using. Now, you can think of that as ORCID IDs, essentially. So, persistent identifiers for individuals. ORCID is a persistent identifier for individuals. Now, a lot of federal agencies are either requiring or encouraging individuals, researchers, to have ORCID IDs when they're submitting for grants or submitting their funding applications to the government, for example. And we're seeing this in the National Security Presidential Memo 33, and you probably heard about that also already. We're also seeing it ORCID-related policies mentioned in OSTP memos on public access for publications that are a result of the federal funded research. So a lot of funding agencies now are coming out with their policies, and Sheila just shared a link to you all where we keep track of all of this information as much as we can on the federal policies, and depending on the agencies that you're looking at, it will tell you whether they are requiring it or whether they're encouraging it or what their next steps are going to be. So we're continuing this kind of um, this particular document to make sure that we have the information as much as possible. And then if you know something that we may have missed, please do let us know so we can add it to the document as well. Now, in addition to federal funding agencies, private funders are also requiring or encouraging um, through their grant process, ORCID IDs throughout the process. So, for example, members of ORCID US Community, like American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, Bright Focus Foundation, and Melanoma Research Alliance, are either requiring or encouraging the use of ORCID in their grant application, as well as in the reporting processes of the grant. All right, so now we talk about funders. On the next slides, um, we'll talk a little bit more about Science CV here. And we've talked a little bit earlier that Science CV, you can log in using your ORCID ID, but you can also use ORCID within Science CV to basically, you can grab your publications from your ORCID record to populate, to create your bio sketches. And this is a good way to really talk to your faculty about, so, or to your researchers. So here you can use the publications or the data that you have in your ORCID record to create your bias sketches. And this is just an example of what you're seeing here actually from my ORCID record, where I'm able to grab publications and I'm able to create an NSF bias sketch here, or biographical sketch. So this is a good way to help your researchers to really think about the benefit of ORCID in grabbing those information available already in their ORCID record to create a bias sketch when they are applying for federal grants. All right. So now on the next slide, let's talk more on the publishing side of things. Publishers are also requiring ORCID IDs. So publishers such as IEEE, Springer Nature, and Wiley are also utilizing ORCID in their systems. So again, researchers can log into to the manuscript system submission systems using their ORCID credentials. And ORCID IDs are also being required throughout that process when you submit your manuscript. This helps basically researchers throughout the process or the publishing workflow. As you can see on the next slide, um, what thing you can do is that it bolsters the researcher's identity as a researcher, of course. It bolsters your identity as a researcher because, for example, publishers are able to push the publication in your ORCID record. So the works, the publications can be added to your ORCID record. You're also seeing here a list of authors, right? So we see author's name with a green orchid icon next to it. When you actually click to that green orchid ID icon, it will take you to the orchid record of that of the researcher. So now you're bringing, we can see what the other things that these researchers have done. So it bolsters the identity of that particular researcher, of the researchers with an ORCID ID. We can also see peer review activities. So publishers can actually push peer review activities to ORCID records. So all of this information are able to be added to the ORCID record. And you don't have to do this. Researchers don't have to, all they really have to do is provide or give permissions to publishers to update their ORCID record. So that way, all of this can be automatically added to your ORCID record. So that's a good kind of benefits that researchers should know about. Um, and this also takes us to on the next slide, where ORCID really, and one of the benefits of ORCID is that it maintains your online presence as a researcher. So it bolsters your identity, but it also maintains your online presence as a researcher. What you're seeing here, and we kind of think of ORCID also as an online CV, right? So here you can see my ORCID record with information about my employment, education, professional activities, as well as works or publications that I've done. So this really represents my work as a researcher or as a contributor in the entire research ecosystem, and it maintains my online presence. So I actually use this, for example, to to when I say like when I'm doing my conference presentations, for example, I could add this to the description, the author's description or the speaker's description. So that way it can be that people could just go to my ORCID record. So that's a great way to do this. And with this also, when you provide permissions to to organizations, they would become trusted organizations in your ORCID record. And a lot of trusted organizations are then able to add information to your ORCID record. So in this way, you don't have to add this information in your ORCID record. So for example, here, where Stanford University is adding distinction in this researcher's ORCID record. So this particular researcher don't have to say that, oh, I received this prize at the university, but now Stanford University is doing that for their researcher. So it's adding a validated entry into your ORCID record, and it's adding that trust marker that Kayla talked about earlier as well. And finally, in the next slide, I want to point out that a big benefit of all of these and having an ORCID ID, an ORCID record, is the benefit of streamlining a lot of the administrative processes. So it could be streamlining faculty reports that we have kind of mentioned a little bit now or earlier throughout this presentation, and streamlining showing the faculty profiles pages. So, for example, here where Florida State University, you're able to, faculty and researchers are able to grab and pull data from their ORCID record to populate their faculty reporting system. And that's a great benefit. So that way you don't have to be typing in or entering your publications again in your faculty reporting system. But now you can just grab that information from ORCID records. And Oklahoma State University, you could also grab and populate your faculty profiles by grabbing and pulling information from your ORCID records. So these are all just some of the benefits that's available right out there and things that you can talk about to your researchers. Now, on the next slide, now that we kind of know about what our talking points are and the things that we should focus on when we talk to our researchers, how can we bring these to our researchers? How can we talk to them about these talking points? What are the ways or the strategies that we can do to reach our researchers? Now, on the next slide, let's talk about the human factor first of doing the outreach, right? Getting the support, building support from administrators, from our faculty. So the first thing really is all about building support for ORCID from our administrators and other stakeholders to get our message across our organizations. So an example here is from Rutgers University, one of the ORCID US community members. So Rutgers University worked with their faculty senate to implement ORCID. And of course, a good thing here also is that they had their university president to give support to this particular initiative. So now you have support from your faculty and also support from your administrators. So working with your own organization's approach, for example, this really helps a lot in building support from the different areas of your campus. So it could be or your organization. So it could be that your organization is more a top-down approach. So having more administrators, letting everyone know that we should do ORCID, we should have ORCID in our organizations. Or it could be that the approach is coming from the researchers first. So having, say, for example, at universities and colleges, would be having the faculty support to do more of a bottom up approach to your own organization. Now, on the next slide, building support is not just, of course, getting support from administrators, but also building support through the different departments or different areas of the organization. So you're going to build a team of experts. So each department, each area of the organization pretty much has its own goals when it comes to ORCID. So, for example, the library may it's probably focused on the publications, especially when it comes to institutional repositories. The grants and sponsored programs or offices will want information on funding data, funding information that's available in ORCID, and talking about how ORCID is is basically beneficial in grant application processes. Now, your human resources office may want to push employment information to ORCID. So other areas of campus have different goals and ways that they would want to utilize ORCID. So really a big part here is about building a team across your organization. So this is a good way to find different solutions that would work best for the entire organization. It addresses the different areas of the organization to find the best way that they could utilize ORCID and the best messaging that you could perhaps share with your researchers from the standpoint of the organization or the department itself. So definitely create or build a team of experts across your organization. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about outreach strategies. So from here on out, some outreach strategies that you can take to promote ORCID to your organization and to your researchers. First things first is creating content that works for your own contacts, right? So culture or the way your organization is kind of set up, it's good to know how those works within your own context. A lot of or In ORCID, we have a lot of resources that's available to you that you can use, but it's always great or wonderful to create your own content that works best for your own organization. So an example here is we're seeing, right? from Ohio University. They've created a series of videos and really, that's about the title of this video, for example, here is Orchid for Ohio Researchers. So building that own kind of content for your own researchers is an important aspect here. You're also seeing a lot of information about Orchid for their own researchers. So putting all of this together in sort of like some sort of a guide, could be from a library standpoint, a LibGuide, or it could be a web page at the organization is really important. So having all of this information put together that builds the content that works best for your own organization. So that's one thing to really think about. On the next slide, we'll take a look at promotional materials that you could also use or create in your own context. So to get the message across on what works best for your researchers, for example, you could create a postcard. So here's an example of postcard from Temple University talking about, if you want to publish uh, in Springer Nature or IEEE or Sage journals, that you're going to need an ORCID ID first. So that's a good way to get the message across. We're also seeing a fact sheet from North Carolina State University talking about ORCID and why ORCID is important to have it here. And then if you want something fun, you can create an ORCID ID cookies, for example. So that's cute, and I'm sure that's probably tasty. So that's a good way to kind of share to your researchers. And finally, another example here is a coaster from University of Arkansas with a factoid about ORCID. So that factoid actually and that particular graphic came from ORCID's brand library. So an outreach resource is available within ORCID, but they use it to create a coaster and a factoid about ORCID. So it takes about an ORCID record is viewed about 100 times per minute. So that's a good example to share to your researchers as well. All right. Now on the next slide, you don't really want to have your researchers wait for you, right? So you don't have to wait for your researchers to come to you to talk about ORCID. We always want to encourage everyone to bring ORCID to your researchers. So, for example, organizations have done tabling events to showcase ORCID to your researchers. So it could also be creating workshops and webinars about ORCID or talking about the talking points about ORCID to faculty meetings. And finally, talking to your new faculty during new faculty orientations. It's a great way to get new faculty started with ORCID. So that's just kind of a simpler, some kind of ideas that you can take to do at your own organization. All right. And for the next slide, we're going to talk about specifically for ORCID members. So if you're an ORCID member now and you have your own integration, leveraging your own ORCID integration is one of the best ways to get your researchers engaged. So here's an example from Boston College encouraging their researchers to connect their ORCID ID with their organization and also having information about ORCID ID at Boston College and a letter from the provost to the faculty and why ORCID is important. So all of these are here available for their own researchers to take a look at and connect their ORCID ID. And on the next slide, we're talking about other ORCID campaigns as well. ORCID campaigns in different venues or different avenues. So reaching out to your researchers about ORCID via email. So one of our funders, Bright Focus Foundation, encouraged their awardees to connect their ORCID IDs with the organization. So that way they could write or push awards or funding that that particular researcher have received. So that's a good way to kind of get people, get researchers connected to your organization. And another example here is from University of Arkansas, providing information about upcoming campaign related to ORCID. So via email, for example, letting everyone know that this is coming up at our organizations. And that way, everyone is aware ahead of time of what's going on. And finally, on the next slide, What a better way to reach your researchers by having researchers talked about ORCID. Testimonials from faculty and researchers are a great way to get the message across. So here's an example from Emory University. They have a series of testimonial videos from their researchers talking about the benefits of ORCID to their own researchers. So hearing it firsthand from other researchers is a wonderful way to kind of get your other researchers to be really engaged with ORCID. So all of this are just some of ideas that you can take to your own organizations to do outreach for your own organization about working. So now I will pass it on to Sheila.
Great, thanks, Paolo. Okay, so in addition to helping researchers understand the value of ORCID and how they can use their ORCID ID in their research and scholarly communication activities and workflows, one of the best ways that an organization can support researchers and leverage the benefits of ORCID is to become an organizational ORCID member. So on the next slide, ORCID is a nonprofit organization that's able to operate sustainably and make ORCID IDs and ORCID records freely available to researchers through an organizational membership structure. So ORCID member organizations get access to the ORCID member API, which, as you've already heard, can be used in local software systems to get researchers' ORCID IDs, read public and limited access data from ORCID records, and also write that trustworthy data to researchers' ORCID records. And this allows organizations across the research and scholarly communication ecosystem to actively participate and contribute to the interoperability and trust in sharing information that ORCID helps to provide. So organizations can join ORCID as either a direct member or through an ORCID consortium for nonprofit organizations. So on the next slide, in the US, we have a nationwide ORCID consortium for nonprofit organizations called the ORCID US Community. And this allows participating organizations to access 5 premium ORCID member API keys for integrating ORCID with multiple local systems, while also saving on ORCID membership fees. Because we have multiple organizations coming together, we can really leverage that community approach with cost savings. And we provide a range of resources and also dedicated support for all questions related to ORCID and help guide organizations along their ORCID adoption journey and bring community members together to share insight and discuss different ideas and approaches. So next slide. The ORCID US Community is administered by Lyrasis in partnership with the Big Ten Academic Alliance, the Greater Western Library Alliance, and the Northeast Research Libraries. Currently, we have over 200 nonprofit organizations participating, mostly universities, but we also have funders, health and hospital systems, researcher associations, and other research groups. Our main goal here is to build a robust community of practice around ORCID in the US, and our community has been actively growing since 2018 when the ORCID US Community Consortium was launched. So if your organization is not an ORCID member yet, you may want to consider joining. So on the next slide, to help organizations navigate the considerations for organizational ORCID membership, a few years ago, we created a public Trello board that lists many of the most common software systems that organizations in our community are using. And on each individual card in the Trello board is a different software system. And we've included information about whether and how each system integrates with ORCID. So this will be a really great resource to check out whether your organization is already an ORCID member or not, to help you get a sense of where ORCID might already be available in systems that you're using, or where you could potentially turn on or build custom integrations with ORCID at your organization. So next slide. To sum up, what are the next steps that everyone can take after this webinar? We've heard a lot of ideas, and so there's a lot to look at, a lot to think about. So to kind of sum it up, Remember that ORCID adoption is ongoing, and there will always be a next step that you can take, regardless of where your organization is on the ORCID adoption journey. Researchers will always be coming and going in their work with your organization, so regular outreach and education about ORCID will help to ensure that researchers affiliated with your organization can start to benefit from using ORCID. And even if organizational membership does not really make sense for your organization, you can still be educating your researchers that you work with about ORCID. It's never too early or too soon or too often, in my opinion. So that's the number one thing to remember as a takeaway. Also, regardless of where your position is located at your organization, there are likely other staff and stakeholders in different areas of your organization that could also benefit from ORCID. So as Paolo talked about, working to build those relationships and expand your network of internal stakeholders in support of ORCID is another step that can be taken. And if your organization is not an ORCID member yet, you may want to consider that. And if your organization is an ORCID member, think about using the ORCID member API to read and write data to and from ORCID, streamline your workflows, and help staff and researchers save time. And whether you're an ORCID member or not, if you are using a vendor system that doesn't have ORCID functionality available or has limited ORCID functionality available, please contact your vendors and ask them to include it or add more functionality to their products. All right, moving on. So as you move forward with your ORCID outreach, working with internal stakeholders and using the ORCID API, you may want to also do some assessment and benchmarking so you can measure ORCID adoption and growth at your organization over time. ORCID members have access to an ORCID member portal where stats are available that show the number of people who have an affiliation with your organization on their ORCID record, as well as how many people have connected their ORCID ID to any integrations that you may have. On the next slide, I want to point out that we also have a search service where we can run an R script for you to gather information about the people who have employment affiliations and education affiliations with your organization on their ORCID record. And if this is something you're interested in, please email us. We'll share our email address in the chat. And finally, the next slide. I know this webinar has been focused on ORCID specifically, but it's important to note that while ORCID is a persistent identifier, or PID, for people, there are other PIDs for other entities in the research ecosystem. And ORCID and all of the PIDs work best when they're used and linked together. So for example, ROR for organizations, DOIs for research outputs and grants, RAID for research projects, and various other PIDs that might be specific to certain disciplines or activities. And these PIDs all have metadata in which other related PIDs can be included. And these connections help us not only make our workflows more efficient, but also help us gain a better understanding of research activity related to specific organizations, regions, and globally. So now we're going to share some resources and upcoming events. We have many, many resources available on our ORCID US Community website. So please do go and look around there. Specifically, I want to point out a few that may be helpful to everyone here in terms of talking to others about ORCID. We have our outreach planning guide, which I linked earlier in the chat. And we also have a new blog that gives an overview or tour of the many different ORCID outreach resources that we have available. So these are great places to start. We also have several events coming up that you might be interested in, and these are all listed on our events page. Tomorrow, we have a webinar where we're going to be focusing on DOIs for research outputs. In June, we have a workshop for researchers coming up, so please do take a look at those. And that brings us to our Q&A period. Thanks so much for joining us today. We've seen a few questions come through the chat so far, so we can address those, but also if anybody has additional questions, please do put those into the chat. And just a reminder that when you leave the webinar today, a brief survey will pop up. So please do answer that survey. We would love to get your feedback on the session today. I'm just seeing a question that just came through. Will there be a workshop on API programming? That is certainly something that we have been thinking about and planning. We did one, I guess time has been flying. I think I did an API webinar in 2020. And I mean, it hasn't really changed much. So the recording for that is on YouTube, and we can share the link to that. But yes, happy to organize another workshop specifically about the ORCID API. I'm seeing another question in the chat. Let's see. It could be easier to maintain faculty profiles if there was an integration with, for example, SSRN or Google Scholar, any possibility of that happening. That is absolutely correct. In terms of getting those ORCID integrations into those types of systems that would make it easier, it is really up to those vendors to include the ORCID API in their product. This is something that we have been promoting. We've reached out to a lot of vendors, including Google Scholar. Whether or not they have been convinced is yet to unfold. There is kind of a workaround for Google Scholar specifically where you can export data from your Google Scholar profile and then re-upload it into ORCID. So it's not a direct API integration. But that's one of the things that we are working on in the ORCID US community is reaching out to those vendors. ORCID also has staff that works with vendors to try to encourage more API integrations with ORCID. And we also have like email templates for certain vendor products. So if your organization is using certain vendor systems and you want ORCID functionality, we have some templates for helping to reach out. We found that when it comes to vendors, they're more likely to listen to their own clients and customers asking for ORCID functionality as opposed to listening to us or ORCID. So that's definitely a consideration. If we were in control of making those integrations happen, we would have already done that. So yeah, we have to get those vendors and service providers on board, and that's something we're always working on. Let's see, I'm seeing another question. So this is a good one. If only one author is logging into a repository and submitting a work on behalf of many researchers, so if there were a lot of co-authors on a certain work, what are the strategies for collecting ORCID IDs from those other co-authors? Because if they can't log in, they wouldn't be authenticated. That's a great question. So there is a workaround with that involves an email workflow. And a few examples of places where that email workflow is being used are OJS, so Open Journal Systems, and also Dryad Data Repository. When whoever is submitting the work to the repository or to the publisher, for example, when they do that submission, they input the email addresses of the other co-authors. And the system has functionality built in where an email automatically gets sent to those co-authors, prompting them to click a button in the email to connect their ORCID ID with that publication or with that work. So that's kind of the known workflow for getting those co-authors ORCID IDs. Whether or not that workflow is implemented yet in all of the different possible repositories or publishing systems, it's just a matter of time before that rolls further into other systems, but that would be the primary workflow for that or strategy for that. I'm seeing another question, and we got a question earlier in the chat around the potential for duplicate work entries getting into somebody's ORCID record. So let's say you published a work and the publisher wrote that to your ORCID record through Crossref, for example, but then that work was also on your Google Scholar profile and that got imported, and now you have two of the same work on your ORCID record. ORCID will automatically group together works that have matching identifiers. So that helps with a lot of the more peer-reviewed scholarly journal kinds of publications that have DOIs, for example. But if you have other works that don't have an identifier, or if that metadata is missing from an entry, it is possible for the individual to go into their ORCID record, and there's a little checkbox where you can select, like, these two works are the same, and you can combine them. So you can tell ORCID, actually, these are duplicates, combine them into one record. So that is how that is addressed. I think we're getting to all the questions. There was a question earlier that said maintaining an ORCID record seems to be just as involved as updating a CV. So how do we convince researchers to do this? Hopefully, a lot of the answer for that was presented in the webinar today around the additional benefits of ORCID. It's not just a static CV on a Word doc. Where ORCID is really special and unique and can really help everyone is that it's set up to where organizations can actually add information to your ORCID record for you. So not only if we get to that point where all of the organizations in this ecosystem are actively contributing and working together, all a researcher really has to do is get their ORCID ID, and then when they go to work with each organization, they can make that connection so that the organization can add the relevant information to their ORCID record for them. That way, we're kind of creating a central hub where information about research activity can be stored, and then different organizations can grab information from that. So all of this is geared towards making it easier for researchers. Let's see. There was a question earlier from the registration form. Is ORCID only for people who have already published? Not necessarily. ORCID is for any individual who is a researcher, wants to be a researcher, is involved in scholarship, and contributor. So the C in ORCID actually stands for contributor. You don't necessarily have to be a researcher. And of course, it's free and open for anyone to get an ORCID ID. Many organizations like universities that work with graduate students that may want to go into some sort of research or scholarly related field. Graduate students can benefit from going ahead and getting an ORCID ID, even if they're not a professional researcher yet, or even if they haven't published yet. It's really helpful to already have that established before you start publishing. But ORCID is especially helpful to people that are actively applying for grants to do research, publishing, and really involved in all those workflows. But you definitely don't need to have already published in order to get an ORCID ID. And just before we wrap up, I do want to point out what Paolo shared in the chat, that we do have a ORCID workshop for researchers coming up on June 4th, and we've got a link to register that. This is free and open to anyone who's interested. So on this workshop for researchers, we go into more detail for researchers specifically about the benefits of ORCID for them, but also tips and tricks on the things that they can do to make it easier to make sure their ORCID record is up to date. So little tools and connections that can be made within the ORCID record to help populate their past publications and stuff like that. So encouraging everyone to join us for that. And that brings us to the top of the hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Hope you learned something. Our email address is here in the chat, orcidus@lyrasis.org. If you have additional questions, or if you want to talk more about ORCID at your organization, or potentially specific challenges or things you're running into related to ORCID, don't hesitate to contact us. This is why we're here. We would love to hear from you. Please do reach out to us at orcidus@lyrasis.org, and we would love to continue this conversation. So thank you, everyone. We'll be sending out the recording and materials from this call shortly, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks so much. Bye.